I mean, you can blame everything on the Jews, right?
Yeah.
I don't even know if I should go with TikTok on this one. They might shut
Oh,
me
no,
down.
no. Why don't you see how long you last?
Well, yeah, but I don't want to lose my station either. Let's just see. Let me rev up my TikTok and see what happens. Um, we'll have to just roll with it. And welcome aboard TikTok, everyone. So, Mike, the issue is that the release of the JFK papers, which of course they're very old fashioned. I mean, we're not talking about things that have been scanned and put online. We're talking about hundreds of thousands, if not millions of documents that need to be combed through very carefully. It's not going to happen overnight. Probably a lot of it is gone because it's been pulled out by people like Mike Pompeo and, the Dulleses, and just over the years. I mean, it's sitting around somewhere for half a century. I don't believe that we're ever going to really get to the bottom of what happened. But there are things coming out. And one of those things really grieves me. It upsets me as somebody who has studied the Kennedy assassination for a long time. I shudder over it, and that is the possibility that Israel was involved in the assassination. Now, this is being discussed by people who have an anti-Israel and anti-Jewish agenda, like Dr. E. Michael Jones, who I heard talk about this earlier today on his podcast. And I would even say people like Candace Owens and others. I even saw that it was briefly mentioned on Steve Bannon's program, although I don't think Steve Bannon has anything to do with that agenda. But the fact of the matter is that regardless of what they're saying and regardless of what they're trying to do, there is some information that needs to be looked at here. It's not a pleasant topic, but I'm going to go there. There is information that indicates that the Mossad might have played a hand in the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Now, why did they do this? According to the theory, they did it because David Ben-Gurion, in particular, the Prime Minister of Israel, was hell-bent on creating a nuclear bomb in Israel for self-defense. It was controversial in Israeli circles. There was a lot of opposition to it, but they were going forward with it. And that Kennedy opposed it. And Kennedy wanted to inspect the plant in Dimona. He sent people over to inspect it. The Israelis were trying to, fudge it. They were trying to fool them and say, oh, it's not really this, it's that. But the fact is that Kennedy, I think there's evidence, and this is history, wanted to shut it down. Now, his interest in shutting it down was not because he was an anti-Semite or because he had anything against Israel. It's because he was against nuclear proliferation of any sort. I mean, we should note that he signed the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty in the summer of 1963.
Right.
One of his goals was to reduce the access to nuclear bombs for good reason. And it's something supportable. He didn't want to expand the nuclear mandate. So Israel's trying to do it. He's against it. But the Israelis, on the other hand, they felt that they needed this bomb because they needed it to defend their sovereignty, their country. That eventually it was going to come out that Arab countries, which were their enemies, would get the bomb. In fact, they did in the case of Iran. And that they felt they had to have it as a deterrent. They weren't trying to use it to conquer anyone, but they felt that by having it and by just having possession of it, it would serve as a deterrent to keep their enemies at bay. So I understand why Israel needed the bomb. I don't begrudge them that. Israel
if that theory is true, then how come they don't have it after all these years?
Israel has the bomb. I mean, I think that's now known. They have a nuclear plant at Dimona.
But at what point did they?
Well, they were at the time of John F. Kennedy. I don't think they quite had it yet. They were working on it. But by the 1970s, sometime around there, they clearly had it. There was a whistleblower amongst the Israelis, this guy Vanunu, who he kind of blew the whistle on it, and the Israelis were able to bring him in using a honeypot. They arrested him, and he was in prison for like 20 years, and now I think he got out. But he blew the whistle on it. It's never been denied. There were pictures of the plant. I think Israel, pretty much, it's kind of an open secret that they have it, and that they tested it actually off the coast of South Africa, and I think they want it known that they're going to use it if they have to. If they're being invaded and Tel Aviv is being attacked, they'll use it. It's just that simple. It's a deterrent. I think if there's one country in the world that actually has a legitimate reason to have a nuclear bomb, it would be Israel, given what they're up against. I think that we saw in real time what Israel is up against on October the 7th
Right.
of 2023, which of course is something that's been going
Here's
on.
here's the point, though. By killing Kennedy, did that help them achieve this?
No. Well, the point is that it didn't, because Lyndon Johnson was just as anti-nuclear as Kennedy was.
Yeah.
And he continued to send inspectors. Of course, somebody like E. Michael Jones, as I said, well, Kennedy was a stooge of the Jews, and he was put in there by the Jews. He might have even been a Jew. And he said, somebody called, one of his callers said, was he a Jew? And Jones said, well, I don't know if he actually was or not. He might have had grandparents who were Jewish, but that doesn't matter. He behaved like a Jew. That makes him a Jew, okay? Just to get an idea of where he's coming from. But the point is that it wasn't until Nixon that he kind of gave a green light to Israel implicitly, not directly, when the Israeli ambassador met with Kissinger, who gave the green light. That's, I think, that's history. I've read about that in conventional history books. I don't think that's a secret. So they did get the nuclear bomb. Kennedy was trying to stop the bomb. Does that mean that Israel conspired to assassinate Kennedy?
I don't think so. I mean, it's one of these theories that's reconstructed afterwards. Okay, as you say, LBJ was against proliferation.
Right.
So what difference would it have made? And the trouble with these Kennedy assassination theories is you create anything you want now, because the truth never really did come out, never really will come out. And so now it's just open season on come up with anything you want.
Well, you can basically fit it into whatever hypothesis you're working on. And somebody like a Dr. E. Michael Jones, his hypothesis is anti-Jewish, so he can feed this in. I mean, when you have somebody who works through that type of a narrative, and they try to develop a particular category, in his case, that category is the anti-Jewish category. It's been around for a long time. You can put in and plug in various facts that support the hypothesis while weeding out other facts that may detract from the hypothesis. So we have to understand that that's where he's coming from. Having said that, I think that there very well may be evidence that Israel played a role in it. I don't think it was the main role, but I could see, look, one of the best books I've read on the topic, and I've read a few, was Dr. Jerome Corsi's book on the Kennedy assassination. I've interviewed him many times. He's kind of retired recently. He no longer does interviews, but I think he's a very good and solid historian. He's written a lot. He's a brilliant guy. He's a Harvard graduate, historian, and, very legitimate researcher who's very careful in his footnotes. And he went over all the conspiracies around the Kennedy assassination. Lyndon Johnson, the CIA, the FBI, the Cubans, the mafia, all of it.
John Wilkes Booth.
Yeah, exactly. He really did a fine-tooth comb examination, I think, of all of it. And his conclusion, and at the time he started the book by saying it's ridiculous that the government's still not releasing information. And he's right, of course. But he said that they're all guilty. All of them had an interest. The Fed, let's not forget, Kennedy released hundreds of millions of dollars of silver certificates into the economy which did an end run around the Fed. There were interest-free fiat, interest-free dollars backed by silver, which was discovered at Fort Knox, I believe. And it was interest-free currency. And he points out that, and I think it's kind of known. I interviewed the late Jim Marr on this topic, who wrote books also very credible about conspiracy. And he notes that going all the way back to Andrew Jackson, presidents of the United States who took on the moneyed interests, the Fed, the promoters of public banking, they ended up either being shot or something else. I mean, and he shows how there's a whole list of people who were, attempted assassinations. I mean, Lincoln issued greenbacks, which was directly from the U.S. Treasury rather than borrow from the bankers.
Yeah.
So he notes that this could have played a role in Kennedy's assassination because, according to Jim Marr, literally before the body was buried, Lyndon Johnson had canceled the silver certificates and had gone back to the Fed fiat currency. The point I'm making here is that all of them had an interest, perhaps, in killing President Kennedy. President Kennedy was one of these presidents who believed that he actually was president. He was acting independently. He was fulfilling the mandate of the people who elected him. And he didn't play ball with these sort of what President Trump calls the deep state, what Eisenhower at the time called the military-industrial complex. And so also the warmongers wanted to have a war in Vietnam, and Kennedy did not. He was going to pull out of Vietnam, according to many sources. So there was an interest in stopping Kennedy. I mean, it didn't happen by accident. It was a bigger conspiracy than the lone nut theory. Walter Cronkite, on the night of the assassination, or within hours of the assassination, went on national television, and back then they had a monopoly practically. And he's the one that announced that it was a lone nut, Lee Harvey Oswald, and that anyone who says otherwise is a conspiracy theorist, and that's evil, and that pay no attention to them. And I think that he was probably told to do that by people who were giving him that platform. We don't know who they were. Could have been Lyndon Johnson. It could have been the CIA. Who knows? And then, of course, Oswald himself was assassinated on national television. You and I remember. I'm sure you saw that.
Yeah.
I did. I'm old enough to remember it. And that the guy who assassinated him, Jack Ruby, otherwise known as Jacob Rubenstein, was part of a kind of Jewish mob group, right, that involved Meyer Lansky. This is my sources here, actually is Dr. Jones. And I think on this point, he's probably right. What he doesn't mention is that this Jewish mafia was this was real thing. This is a real thing. I mean, I personally can speak to this. I mean, my mother's family was involved in it in Boston, right? I'm not going to make a secret about it. Doc Sagansky was a major mob figure in Boston in the 1920s. He was a Jew and he was a dentist. That's why they called him Doc. And then his sons, they went straight. They went legitimate after he was gone. But the point is that there really were Jewish mobsters. And, this was not a joke. But what's not mentioned there is that they were junior partners to the Italian mob. And also in Boston, there was the Irish mob, which eventually manifested with Whitey Bulger and the Winterhill Gang. They terrorized Boston throughout the 1980s, along with Angiulo and his crew, which came out of the Patriarcha in Providence. And then there was the Protestant mob coming out of Kansas City in the Midwest and out of Arkansas. And, then now more recently, you've got other mobs coming in, the Russian mob, the Asian mob gangs. It's nothing new. And now we have, of course, the illegal aliens at Trinalagua. I mean, all those people. If you don't fight them, they're going to take over. Yeah. And in Boston, they terrorized Boston for a long time. So the Jewish mafia might be a part of this constellation, but they kind of faded away as Jews became more assimilated. I think the same thing is true with Italians. As they kind of made a few bucks and moved to the burbs, it sort of, people went legitimate and it kind of began to fade and disappear. And that, what also E. Michael Jones doesn't mention with regard to Kennedy is that Kennedy's father played ball with the mob, right?
Oh yeah.
With the bootlegging coming in from Canada and all the rest, and that's been very well documented. He says that RFK was assassinated because he wanted to crack down on the mob, and since the mob was Jewish, according to him, therefore Robert Kennedy was killed by the Jews. I mean, I'm saying that this kind of logic fits a particular narrative that always has some elements of truth.
Well, that's right.
But you have to basically put it in
shoehorning the rest of it. I mean, you can find all these little facts,
right?
You say element of truth, but when you construct this years later, and it doesn't really explain anything. Okay, it for people that like these theories and like these conspiracies. But the trouble with this stuff is it's always so much after the fact, and everybody involved is dead. And
well, the thing is, I think we do have to learn from this, because the Kennedy assassination was a coup d'etat, and it did change the way this country has been governed ever since, and it was not for the better. We had, after
as you say, he was trying to really be a real president.
Well, not only that, but and Kennedy was a conservative. He was a Catholic. He had all of the best aspects of American leadership. And you can see what happened after he was killed. I mean, you can tell who was behind the conspiracy based on what interests did take over the United States after his assassination. Those interests were the warmongers who wanted to go into Vietnam, those who supported the concept of perpetual war for perpetual peace, the world order types that go back to Wilson, and along with their neocon friends. You have the people who wanted to launch the socialistic war on poverty, Great Society programs, which basically nationalized the American economy. It nationalized things like welfare. It basically moved the country in a direction away from what we had been mostly, which was more of a sovereign country with states' rights and with local control of things like welfare and charities, and many other things. I mean, it moved the country into the kind of the world order globalist system that now President Trump is trying to dismantle. So those are the people who were behind the assassination, and their whole secret apparatus. What, as I mentioned, Michael Glennon talks about, calls it the double government, the Trumanites, the secret CIA, FBI, NSC, all of these agencies that have their own interests involved, and that those interests tend to not necessarily be patriotic. They tend to be world order, and Kennedy, as a nationalist, stood in the way of that. So you had this kind of loose coalition of interests that wanted to stop Kennedy, and that, yes, it may have included Israelis. Maybe Israel did want to be involved in it. If the only, and that's disgusting to me, and I am horrified over this. I'm really kind of grappling with it. The only thing that I'd say in explanation for it is that, at least in the case of Israel, unlike these world order types, the Anglo-American establishment, the CIA, the mob, all of these people, the Israelis were doing it because they were watching their national interest. And at that time, they believed that national interest included their having a bomb. And whether right or wrong, that's what they believed. They felt that it was imperative that this is Ben-Gurion. He made no bones about it. He wanted the bomb. And he wanted
to for them to just blackmail Kennedy. Because remember, in the early 60s, all these salacious affairs would have upset the public. Now nobody cares. But back
Well, you
then,
know something, I mean, I think that Michael Jones brings that up, and I've heard this also, that the reason Kennedy put Johnson on the ticket was because he was told that if they, he'd be blackmailed. I mean, he was obviously an adulterer. Obviously, he was involved with whatever. And that, yes, back then people did care about that, and that could have destroyed his reputation. So maybe he was being blackmailed to an extent. But if that was true, I guess that maybe he was stepping out of that by engaging in activities that they felt like, well, maybe blackmail isn't going to work. I guess we'll have to assassinate him. I don't know, but yeah, that was a part of it. I mean, blackmail is an old game. I mean, I think that Woodrow Wilson was blackmailed into getting into World War I because he was apparently having an affair between his marriages. His wife died, but then he had an affair with a married woman, and of course, back then, apparent letters came out later. His handlers, particularly Edward Mandell House, the Texan colonel, they said, "Hey, we have these letters, and we're not going to reveal them, but we have to get involved in this war." So, yeah, I mean, blackmail is an old story. But the point I'm making is that, I think Israel very well might have been a part of this general coalition of people who did conspire to assassinate.
Well, it could be, but I guess the big question is, then who actually did it? I mean, we could sit here and name 50 groups that may have an interest in killing the guy, but that doesn't mean they were all
I just
involved.
lost my TikTok.
Really?
Yeah, that's, oh well, that's that. Thank you, TikTok. I was wondering how long it would take.
Wow.
I think it was my comment about Israel, being involved. Although, I mean, TikTok has people on there that are saying this, but I guess somehow me saying it is another story. I don't know.
No, because then you're a complete traitor. If
A
you as
traitor,
a famous
to
Jewish
my race.
are saying that, yeah.
Let me just see if they've completely shut me down on TikTok.
You should be eating your.
No, I think that, no, the account looks good. They're just not going to let me do any live streaming for 2 weeks. All right, whatever. Anyway,
Yeah.
getting back to the subject.
So I don't know. I mean, it's one thing to name all these interested parties, but that doesn't say who actually created the conspiracy. There's no way that all these people could have acted in concert. So who
That's
actually
true.
did it? Is
Who
still
actually did it?
Yeah.
I hope we find out, because I think that I think that evidence, according to, like, I don't know, Roger Stone has written about this. I think he's a pretty good source. He insists that it was Lyndon Johnson, and I think that if anybody gained from it, it was Johnson. And Johnson was a very unscrupulous figure he hated the Kennedys. He would do anything to take. This was his chance to grab the presidency.
Well, he could have arranged it. He was high enough in government.
Right.
He could have found rogue agents.
Not to mention the fact that he was about to be indicted for scandals that could have put him in prison, and that Kennedy apparently had made it known that he was not going to run his reelection with him.
Right.
And he had the Bobby Baker scandal and the
Billy Saul Estes.
Right? There was all this kind of, Johnson was corrupt up to his neck. I mean, from day one. I mean, he stole the election in Texas originally. I mean,
1948. Yeah.
He was a tough guy who just had the kind of ambition that he would just do anything. He was like Bill Clinton on speed. I mean, probably an enemies list that included a death list. Who knows? I'm just saying that it certainly would not be, beyond him.
Well, he was, and the other thing about him that's interesting is he was kind of erased from American history in that, okay, the guy died in 1973. Nobody really talks about him very much. Nobody looks into his daughters, and you don't hear about the guy at all. You'll occasionally see an article about Amy Carter, of all people, but you won't see anything
about his family.
Yeah, about his family.
that's a good point. I mean, he kind of went through, dropped into the memory hole.
Yeah.
I mean, the other people, the other guy that had some interest was Allen Dulles. Kennedy fired him.
Yeah.
Kennedy said, "I'm going to break the CIA and again, what Michael Glennon calls this double government into 1,000 pieces." Right? I mean, there was a lot of people who had an interest in this. I mean, the generals who, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, were very angry that Kennedy didn't go forward with a war against Cuba. That he had
Well,
made
I
a
think
deal.
the most obvious hypothesis would be Johnson puts together a conspiracy. He can easily find disaffected military/CIA types. Doesn't take that many people to arrange this, and set up a couple of people on the grassy knoll. Ha!
Oh yeah, no, I mean, there's evidence. Apparently, I mean, again, the information from all of these documents is just coming out.
Yeah,
But there's information that indicates that Oswald wasn't even in the Texas school book depository.
yeah,
He
yeah.
had
Well,
nothing to do
I
with
had
it.
heard that years ago.
Yeah, that it was very concocted. I mean, he was the classic patsy. Of course, he won't he will never testify because they killed him. You know, just like Michael Jones was right again. I mean, he says that they killed bin Laden rather than bring him in for testimony to find out what actually this was about. Get rid of him, you know, eliminate him so that there's no, you know, the secrets are buried with him. And, you know, I mean, there was a long list of, I wrote about this in my own book about assassinations in America. Besides looking at the Kennedy assassination, there is a fairly lengthy list of other people who died under mysterious circumstances, who were peripherally, if not directly involved in that assassination. Most famously, Dorothy Kilgallen, but many, many others who, you know, they just, there's this one woman that Kennedy was having an affair with who was starting to talk loosely. She was taking a lot of dope. All of a sudden, she's beaten and killed while out on a jog in Washington one day. I forget her name, but I'm just saying, you know, this was suppressed. I mean, there was a lot going on in terms of keeping control of that story.
Well, on the Dorothy Kilgallen thing, what I never understood about that was she was very smart. All right, did she not know that maybe this wasn't a great idea to start running her mouth about this sort of thing?
I mean, you know, I mean, here you and I are running our mouths about it. I mean, it makes me nervous. It's like she was very courageous. I don't think she probably did know how bad it was. She should have known, you know, because she was a prominent figure. I mean, and she was about to release an article, I think, if not a small book on it, that has never seen the light of day.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, it's there's a lot of stuff like that around this assassination. And you know, I think that we could look, I mean, in my book I look at the assassination of a lot of people that, or attempted assassinations, where you could see where people had an interest in doing it because the person was either obstructing their ambitions, whether they be political or financial, or that they wanted to change the course of history in another direction, and they had to get rid of that person in order to do it. I mean,
Well, one that you probably mentioned in your book was Marilyn Monroe, but the contrast between her and Kilgallen, you know, Monroe was a lot of things. She was very bright, all right? So she just was emotional, decided that she was going to blow the whistle on these guys, and had this mysterious overdose.
Oh, that's an ugly story. I mean, if you go into that, it's writing that book was really creepy. I mean, it was just really nasty. I mean, look, another one, I didn't get into this. I actually had an author on later, was the Catholic priest Thomas Merton, who died under mysterious circumstances.
Oh, that was really weird. I never got the true version of that because it.
Yeah. And I think in his case, it was because he had a huge influence amongst particularly young Catholic men. He was very popular. He wrote a book that was a big seller in the
He had
19.
about 4 or 5 books that were pretty
Yeah, we had
popular.
one in particular that it actually brought a lot of men to the priesthood. It brought a lot to Catholicism. And he was about to come out strongly against the Vietnam War. I even wonder if Abraham Joshua Heschel, who was the Jewish version of Thomas Merton, who wrote a hugely popular book in the 1950s, God's relationship to man, or something like this. Very good writer. I read his book on the Sabbath, which is excellent. But he was coming out as an anti-war guy in the 1960s, and he died suddenly, and he was pretty young at the time, and there was no evidence that he had any particular health problems. Just saying.
The Merton death was even more suspicious.
Well, he was
so cliche.
They found like electric wire wrapped around his neck. I mean, it was not, that looked like a murder, clearly. So, look, what I'm suggesting here is that a lot of things happen where people can be inconvenient, right? We don't even talk about the Clinton list, which is lengthy.
Yeah.
But, when people are in that kind of power or that kind of wealth, they're not immune to using it to preserve their position or to advance their position and to stop anyone or anything or any group that may threaten it. I mean,
you can be as prominent as hell and it doesn't matter. Look at Jimmy Hoffa.
That's right.
They're never going to figure that one out either.
Even Jimmy Carter, I mean, I think I've talked about this. It's one of the things I go into my book. He was about to release all of the Kennedy information, and somebody probably didn't want him to release it because he was delivering a speech in Los Angeles, and these two guys were picked up who were found like standing in like a room with weaponry, and that they were planning on shooting him as he was speaking. One of them's name was Lee Harvey something, and the other one's name was Oswaldo something. Right? They were homeless guys. They were held for like 2 hours at a police station, and then they were released, never to be heard from again. But the media did a big story on it, using their names. And Jimmy Carter read this, right? And he goes, oh, okay, I get the story. Maybe I better hold off on releasing the Kennedy file, I'm just saying that, this is the kind of thing that is done. I mean, it's not unusual. It's normal, actually, somewhat, when you have people in power who threaten power. Tim Russert, I looked at that in my story. He died pretty young, at the height of his career. What did he do? Again, I'm not saying that he was assassinated, but he, during the election of 2004, he conducted an interview with both John Kerry and George W. Bush. And he asked each of them about Skull and Bones. You're in Skull and Bones. Tell us, did you take an oath of loyalty to them? What does it mean to you? What are they really the secret establishment? And both men answered him in almost the identical expression and elusive language of evasion. We don't discuss Skull and Bones. Ha ha ha. We can't really talk about that because it's secret. Now, some people say that that's why Russert was killed. He brought this to the public's attention. No one had known about this. Anyway, to go back to the story at hand, I think that it's deeply upsetting to me, and it's, as somebody especially from Boston who loves the Kennedys, and Kennedy in particular, and who remembers the whole thing. And I remember how lionized he was afterwards, especially in the Jewish community. I mean, he was just loved.
Well, on the one hand, you should be proud that the Jews were big time players and could be involved with the mafia, CIA.
It grieves me that they were, but I don't. At the same time, I get it.
Yeah.
It's an ugly chapter, and I hope it's not true, but I'm not going to shy away from it if it
Well,
is.
I don't think that other than being an interested party, they had anything to do with pulling the trigger. You could make a
No,
list of
yeah.
dozens.
I mean, I think that they were part of, if they were part of anything, it's just that. I mean, they were junior partners. They might have had
They
some,
help with some of the money and logistics,
right. They might
but
have.
that's about it.
No, I agree. I mean, I think we don't know the main players. I think the main players, if there were any, was Johnson, the FBI, the CIA rogue elements there. And I think that's kind of at this point been established. At the same time, I'm not going to shy away from Jewish involvement or Israeli involvement in it.
Yeah.
And I don't like the fact that the ADL and Jewish organizations want to censor any mention of any criticism of Israel, and that they want to call it anti-Semitic, which it was not necessarily, and that John F. Kennedy certainly was not anti-Semitic, and that look at, I mean, the record is not perfect. History is history. I believe primarily in free speech and the right to engage in dialogue and discuss these things openly and candidly as we can, as a way to sort of see the whole picture. If you suppress it, then you're going to have somebody like people who don't have Israel's best intention, isolated and have the upper hand in terms of a dialogue about it, because they're going to get through. So I want to talk about it as best I can. Anyway,
Well, just on that topic for another moment.
yeah.
You can create all these quote Jewish conspiracies about whatever you want, but how did E. Michael Jones fall into this trap? What made him get obsessed with this approach to history?
I don't know. I was listening to his interview earlier today, and he made passing reference to Sam Francis, who you've talked about, who was, I guess he was a Catholic commentator who became obsessed with Judaism. And
He was playing to his audience, which ended up being white nationalists, but I still to this day don't think he was really a prejudiced guy as much as he was becoming somewhat desperate in gaining an audience because he'd been kicked off
right.
some fairly major forums.
So he went to like some extremes in order to be relevant and keep. And likewise, Joe Sobran.
Sobran was the same thing.
Who I also, I had interviewed him back then. I don't have a tape of it because this was before the internet when I was doing radio, and I admired him immensely and his great thinking. But then he seemed to have gone way off the page on Jews and on Israel toward the end of his life. I don't know. It's I don't question the sincerity of it. I just wonder what happened.
Well, it's kind of like your old friend, Brother Nathaniel, right?
Oh boy.
He was a former Jewish guy.
Yeah.
And he disliked his childhood upbringing. And let's face it, and you'd be the first to admit this, you could find a lot of Jewish influence in a lot of historical events that may not have been that great.
Right.
And if you obsess on that sort of thing, you can come up with this unified theory that it's the Jews,
Right. And you could also, you're sharing away some of the really great and important elements of Jewish history that has contributed to making a better world and has added a great intellect. So, but yeah, you can find some pretty bad players. I mean,
so I think that if you look through that prism and exclusively through that prism, you're going to come up with a somewhat distorted point of view.
It happens when you go, anybody who totally focuses on constructing a category.
Yeah.
is going to, at some point lose some integrity, and that they're going to cherry pick stuff that adds to this category and discard stuff that doesn't. And as a result, the focus becomes not based on reality. It's I mean, we all have our.
Well, I mean, there might be some reality to it. If you look at Julius and Ethel Rosenberg,
Well, yeah, but it becomes distorted because you're isolating. I mean, we all have our. And I want to talk about them also, but we all have our confirmation bias.
yeah, of
They
course.
call it in sociology. My confirmation bias is that I'm pro-American. I love, and I'm willing to turn a blind eye every so often, and embellish the good stuff. Same thing with I'm pro-Boston. I'm a Boston guy. I look at our history. I tend to view that in a positive way, and I'm pro-Jewish. So we all have our confirmation biases, but at the same time, I try to look at things objectively as well as a way to improve. When I criticize the state of Israel and their society, and when I criticize Jewish history and Judaism, it's not because I'm trying to tear it down. Same thing with the United States. I'm not trying to tear down this country. I want to improve this country, make us better by identifying some of our weak points, some of our foibles, some of the mistakes. That to me is the best approach. This is my main criticism of the left. They're not bringing up, I mean, you look at some of their treatises about Americans' role in the world and the terrible things. Yes, those are big things, but they're not doing it with good motives. They're doing it because they want to tear down this society. They want to transform it into a communist society. And so they're using these things. I would say the same thing with due respect to Dr. Jones. His criticism of Israel and of Jews, it very well may be in many ways true in specific circumstances, but his intentions and his motives are not good. I mean, he's bringing it up to tear it down, to destroy it, not to improve it. And also, as far as I'm concerned, he might consider looking at his own house before attacking someone else's. You should look at Catholicism and the Catholic Church, which is a wonderful edifice that should be upheld, not torn down, but at the same time, it's not perfect. You have to clean your own stables before you go looking at someone else's.
Or take the plank out of your own eye before you remove the speck in your neighbor's. Right?
Yes, exactly.
As said by the greatest Jew of all time. So there you go.
That's right. No question. And probably the greatest man to ever live, as we know. I want to bring up another subject since we have a little more time. There's a general discussion on the left right now that is troubling to me. I saw it when I watched a discussion with the talking heads of The Atlantic, which is a mouthpiece of the left, right? Right, headed up by that skunk Goldberg who created all those lies about Trump, and the other guy there who's a CIA plant. And they were going on and on and on about a threat to democracy. The other thing they were talking about is a possible civil war. We're reaching a breaking point where this country is going to fall into a civil war, and how this is like the United States in the 10 or 15 years leading up to the Civil War of Lincoln's time. And these are people who know what they're doing. This is the mouthpiece of the deep state. I think we have to be very, very careful, because I think that it's a projection. It's a foreshadowing of what they have in mind. Now, I remember it was a couple of years before the so-called pandemic. There were several movies that came out which showed a pandemic.
Yes.
One of which I remember, it had Dustin Hoffman in it. I don't remember the name of it, but it showed that there's this disease, and it showed what they had to isolate this community, and if you caught it, they were taking the mother away, and she's screaming, and she has this thing. We have to eventually they found some kind of an anecdote, but it was a horror show of what they were doing.
I think Donald Sutherland was in it also.
Yeah, I think you know the one I was talking about.
Yeah.
It was absolutely terrifying,
Yeah.
right? They had this guy who he had it and he didn't know it, and he got on an airplane. It was a monkey disease spread by monkeys, and they showed him on the plane. He's like falling apart, sweating, and everybody on that plane when they landed the plane had to be isolated. Then the army came in, and it was an absolute freaking nightmare. But these were the kinds of things that were put out there, I think, as a foreshadowing. Maybe I'm putting on my tin hat now, okay? I'll admit. But it was almost fulfilled with the pandemic. So I wonder if they're trying to set us up as a country for a civil war. I mean, even like as I was coming back to my home today in a very nice town in a neighborhood of Boston where I live, there were people standing out on the Rotary with signs saying, "End the oligarchy. Stop Trump's dictatorship. Trump's a dictator," right? And of course, I drove by and I went like this, and they're like, "Oh," but who are these people? I mean, who is doing this? It's like, does this make any sense? It's like
This oligarchy thing was started by Bernie Sanders,
right.
And the irony, of course, is most of the oligarchs are on the left, but they'll want you to not realize.
Oh, sure. I felt like saying they were out with signs about Musk. I'm like, yeah. Great. What about George Soros? I mean, the point is that, yes, they are on the left. And I wonder if they're cooking something up and there may be some kind of a trigger to create this civil war.
Well, I mean, the good news and the only good thing that came out of the pandemic was that I don't think people are going to quite fall for this again.
Right.
Because remember, livelihoods were lost. People couldn't bid farewell to their dying grandmother. It was horrific, and it was the most catastrophic failure of public health in human history. And I say that because we knew better, and yet we did that. And no one's paid the price, by the way.
No, they haven't.
Fauci is going to be slightly dishonored, but he gets to live on.
I noticed in Boston at the Boston Symphony Hall, they have the speakers series every year where they bring up the most left-wing the anti-Trump crowd. They had Fiona Hill last year. Okay, she was one of the people who cooked up the perfect phone call impeachment.
Right.
This year they're having Anthony Fauci. I'm like, oh my God. I mean, I can't believe that he's stepping out in public after.
The thing a lot of people don't know about Fauci is he was despised for decades. He was never this revered figure.
No.
In fact, a very good friend of mine, who's a retired allergy immunologist guy, met him in like the 80s or 90s. And I remember he told me the time, he said, "Who the hell is this guy? He doesn't know anything. He's a jerk," And the only good news is
power.
Yeah, well, because if you're in charge of all these grants, now the other stupid thing, which finally ended, I think yesterday, his wife, who was the head bioethicist of NIH, finally got canned. And her reputation was, well, she's very nice, but she's a little conflicted, wouldn't you say, that her husband is the head of NIAID. So how he became this figure, it's only because, well, it's like my latest piece,
Yeah.
It's called Government Agency Stockholm Syndrome. It's that you identify with your oppressor. And because everybody now hates Tony Fauci, well, he must be a good guy or something. And all your friends on the left are going to raise this guy up.
Oh, they revere him. He's like a saint. I've had people tell me, I love Anthony Fauci. It's like,
what
really?
good did he ever do? I have no clue.
No, it's like, but he's a cult figure for the left. I think that they, as I said recently, they're nostalgic over the pandemic. They
Yeah.
fetishize it. It was like the ultimate example of complete government control over all aspects of our lives. And it came very close to doing that. And people are excited over that on the left. They actually look back at it romantically as a time of
It
great.
just blows my mind. I mean, you're absolutely correct, but it is so hard to understand
It's
why.
well, I mean, they love authority. You know, they have this vision of like a leap into this great future where everything is hermetically sealed and controlled, and that all human beings become
Right.
basically human resources that can be experimented on. It's I think that Huxley talked about this in A Brave New World, a world that has been anesthetized by a drug. In that book he calls it soma.
Right.
Hasn't that come true to an extent? Most people today are on some kind of a pharmaceutical, and that those things can alter your consciousness. I mean, Huxley, just before he committed suicide, which ironically he did on television, and it so happened that that particular show was not seen by anybody. Why? Because it was on November 22nd, 1963,
Oh yeah, that's
right? So he didn't
talk
catch it.
about a conspiracy.
Yeah,
Wow.
right. But he was a whistleblower at the end. I mean, he said, the goal here is to turn the entire planet into a chemical concentration camp where everybody is controlled by this external mechanism. In this case, it's a drug that he called soma, a fictional drug. Actually comes from a Greek term. And that he was not far off. You know, this is what they crave, complete control. This is what the whole transhumanism thing is about. And with its subcategories such as transgenderism, we can control who you are. We can decide whether you're male or female or neither or both. And we can do it when you're born, when we assign you a so-called gender, which is not even a real thing. It's a
We
sociological
control the
term.
horizontal. We control the vertical.
Yeah. It's the ultimate dream of them. They're going to replace God in heaven with their look at Whittaker Chambers, as I've said many times. He talks about this in his book, Letter to My Children, the first chapter of his book, which I think is must reading. It's incredible. We have a choice between God or man, and that the man side, the communist side, which is what it was called in his day, it's the world's second oldest religion. It was a religion that was promulgated by the serpent in the Garden of Eden, which represents Satan. He said to Eve, you can be as God. You can know good and evil. You can know all things. You can pierce the veil between the natural and the supernatural world and become eternal and know everything. That is the goal of the communist left. It has been with us in every generation from the time of Adam and Eve until today, and that they have tried to use methods of subversion and fraud to fool the rest of us using things like soma or whatever, and we would come to worship them. That's what idol worship was all about. That's what the entire Torah talks about when it talks about the dangers of idol worship. The idol was a false god. It was set up by a clique of men who were using it as a front to control people. That's what it was, as opposed to what the Lord God, King of the universe, commanded, which was to look beyond earthly powers and to worship the one God, not these arbitrary things created by other people, but to worship immutable truth, to understand that there is a truth to the universe. There is an order to the universe, what the Greeks called logos, what the Talmud calls nomos. This is what they are trying to subvert, and they try to do it in every generation. Anyway, so Mike, what do you have coming up on the Substack?
Well, it just came up today. It's the government agency Stockholm Syndrome. And if you look at the reaction, of your leftist friends
Yeah.
to the trimming down of the government, I mean, it's laughable.
Oh my God. You think,
Identify
it's so irrational.
that now you could make an argument if it were true. Look at the great job Health and Human Services have done, but they haven't. The chronic disease is the worst among the first world. You have tremendous fraud and waste in these agencies, but they're so conditioned that we have this established order. That's it. You can't change it. And they identify with their captors, so to speak. But I also point out that the public has sort of a mixed mind about this, as was mentioned by none other than John Wayne at the time of the Penny Hearst trial for the Hibernia Bank robbery that she was involved in back in the 70s, if you remember that.
Yeah, I do.
And she was found guilty, even though your neighbor, F. Lee Bailey, argued that she was brainwashed and so on. Well, Wayne made a very good observation. He said, well, wait a minute. How come everybody said that when those 900 people committed a mass suicide in Jonestown, they were brainwashed? But now you take a little girl from a sheltered background and, you know, she was raped and held captive and whatnot, but she did all this of her own free will. It's like, wait a minute. But it's almost like we're going to hold her individually responsible. But when 900 mostly black people off themselves, I guess they were too stupid to have figured it out. It's just a very weird dichotomy with this. So, ironically, the Stockholm Syndrome does not appear in the DSM, even though post-traumatic stress syndrome, which would seem to be fairly similar, does. So that's the only thing I can come up with.
Right.
In looking at how people are reacting to, we have an agency with 90,000 employees and we're going to get rid of 10,000 and it's the end of the world, you know?
Oh, it's very bizarre that they would, I mean, the Department of Education, billions and billions of dollars spent on fancy parties and lavish lifestyles, and maybe about 10 or 15% of it actually going to education, and even then, not good education.
Yeah. I mean, but there's no results. You know, I'd be less inclined to worry about the fancy parties if they had some results.
I mean, the fact is that the United States was, I think, number 1 or 2 or 3 in the world at the time that department was created in 1979. Now we're like number 40.
Yeah.
It's like, and you know, they're like, oh, this is tyranny that he's, anyways. Yeah, it's really scary, and they're very dangerous. I mean, in terms of threatening, you know, Elon Musk and all of this, it's just, and yet they, you know, God willing, they continue to go on and continue to push forward.
I mean, one of the things that's come out here, I mean, I've said on the show many times that people are afraid to admit how many sickos really are out there. But now these Tesla vandals are being exposed on a daily basis. And I said, well, this is a regular looking guy. I'm telling you, it's depressing as hell. And for some reason, I noticed this even as a young kid.
Yeah.
There are a lot of weirdos around here. And
weirdos who don't look weird. I mean,
yeah.
You know, they look like, I happened to attend the trial. I just had an opportunity at one point. I watched a little of it of one of these mobsters. He's in Boston, the rifleman Flemmy, right?
Oh.
He's responsible for probably at least 20, 25 murders personally, you know, burying people in Boston Harbor back in the height of the mafia time. And yet there he is at the stand looking like somebody's nice little old grandfather with a little tie. And, you know, you would never, ever know what he did or what he was capable of doing.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. Do people expect these types to look like a monster? I mean, I've never understood that. You know,
Yeah, or either that, or I mean, Hollywood glamorized the mob anyways with the Godfather movies. The mobsters started going out and getting fancy suits. They wanted to
yeah.
look like Al Pacino. Anyway, so Michael, I have your Substack link to the show here. Again, remind people of.
Yeah, take a look at it. There are, and I linked to a very detailed description of the Patty Hearst trial uh, and why she got convicted.
Right.
And it's interesting because they say that Lee Bailey went with this brainwash thing, I think mostly because her parents wanted to go that route. And to this day, I don't think that this little sheltered girl suddenly turned into Tanya, the bank robber.
Right.
But that was a weird time in American
Oh,
history with this Symbionese Liberation Army and all this stuff.
I remember that I interviewed F. Lee Bailey before he passed away. I wish I had tape. This is before the tape.
Oh,
And he was insisting that what's his name was innocent, the football player, who killed his wife and her lover, O.J. Simpson. Having a senior moment here. Yeah, I insisted that O.J. Simpson. He was on that trial, innocent. Anyways, Mike, again, as always, thanks for joining me.
Very interesting. Let's try to get Michael Jones on, and this Glennon guy on the same show.
Well, I know that Michael Glennon, he came on my show, the author of The Double Government, as I've mentioned, and I brought up his own book to him, and I quoted from his own book, and he did not appreciate that.
No.
He didn't disagree with my conclusion.
No, he just wanted to be some unknown academic, but you outed him.
Using his own material, and again, he didn't disagree with me, but he was very unhappy with my understanding, my interpretation. And I reached out to him recently as a new book. He doesn't want to come on with me. As far as Michael Jones, I don't know. I've been on with him many times. We'll see. I mean, he's coming out with a new book. Maybe I'll contact him for that. I don't know. We'll see. Anyways, so Mike, as always, thanks a lot. God bless America. Everyone stay safe.